Yo, I'm Troy, this is TM Fitness, let's talk evidence. So I think it's important to cover this topic. Why is evidence-based approach to health and fitness, or anything for that matter, important? Because if you're not basing your advice and your practice on scientific, empirical evidence, then you're basing it on what? On theory, on opinion. It's important to understand how the hierarchy of evidence occurs, how it is, how we come to the conclusions that we then say are evidence-based. So you start off with a theory. So somebody come up with a theory and they'll say, I think if we did this and this would happen. And then they present that theory to some of their peers and their peers read it and they debate it and they go, she might have a point there. If X and Z were done, this outcome might occur. That seems feasible. Let's test it. So the next phase is to then do some tests, and depending on what you're testing and how it's possible to test that thing, you would usually start down the bottom of the pyramid here with an in vitro test. In vitro is stuff that's taken out of the body and done tested in isolation using petri dishes and test tubes and that kind of thing. So for example, if you wanted to test whether sugar has an effect on insulin, you'd put some insulin in a test tube, you'd stick some sugar in it and you go, yeah, sugar reacts with insulin. That's a thing. But then all that is doing is testing one mechanism in an entire chain of events. And it's not looking at how that chain of events affects an entire organic organism. So the next thing to do then is to test it on animals, because you have to make sure that it's safe and effective before you go on to testing it on humans. Whether you like that or not, it's a thing, get used to it. So usually it's rats or mice. So whatever you've tested in vitro, you then go, okay, let's test it on an organism. And then you look at it and go, yeah, actually something happened there. There was a reaction. This is worth exploring further. So once you've tested it on animals, there will be, so ideas will be debated, there will be editorials written on it, opinions will be posted, and then we move on to looking at case reports and case series, where you're starting to look at individual case studies, and then you move on to case control studies and then cohort studies. So you're now starting to look at this in individuals and looking at it in groups of people. And if after you've tested all these things, next protocol will be randomized control trials, where you're testing like usually two groups of things to see if a thing is a thing compared with another thing. And then once you've done that, you look at all the available data, and groups of scientists will get together and they will analyze a vast array of data. They will discard anything that they don't agree with. And when I say agree with, this isn't an opinion thing. They're looking at the methods used. They're looking at the equations and the stats that have been used. Have they done their maths correctly? Things like that. The ethical approaches here. They'll be looking at funding and all that kind of stuff. And at the end of it, they come up with a pretty good statistical analysis of all the available data on the thing. And then from there, we can form that into protocols and positional stands, so that we can then say, well, look, here's an overwhelming weight of evidence to prove that this is a thing. And if you do it this way, it's going to work for most people in this manner. So that's why evidence is important, because without that, all you have is opinion and theory. And if it's untested, how do you know you're not doing harm? Let's talk about those RCTs a little bit more. So the randomized controlled trials, you'll start off with a null hypothesis. So this is the thing that you're testing. And then you'll have two groups. There may be a third group. Sometimes there's what is known as a control group. It depends what you're testing. If this is an exercise, for example, you'll have an intervention group that are doing one type of exercise, and another group that are doing a different type of exercise, and then you'll compare results to see which exercise is most effective for whatever it is you're testing. Is resistance training better than aerobic conditioning for fat loss, for example? If it's a supplement or a food substance, you might then test, you'll have an intervention group and a placebo group, and usually these will be blinded. which means they don't know if they're taking the intervention or they're taking the placebo. And there may be, as I say, a control group here. And then that gives you a pretty good idea, because then you're testing two things against nothing rather than just two things against each other. And if it's completely blinded, the scientists that are analysing that data will be blinded as well. So they don't know which group they're assessing, which removes any bias, which is really important. Once you've done that test, you then write up your outcomes and you make your conclusion based on the data that you've collated in that test, and then that will go away and that will be looked at by another group of scientists, and this is your peer review. So they will look at it and make sure that all your methods and all your calculations and your conclusion are agreeable, and if they disagree with anything, they may reject that trial, or they may tell you to go back and recalculate it and redo some of your sums. And that's important. The peer review process is important. I'll give you a great example. A lot of these fad diet books, like the South Beach diet, was shown in analysis that more than 60% of the references in that book were not peer reviewed, which means that the authors were cherry picking bad science to support their own bias. And that's terrible. So I'll give you an example here of how this works in our favour, how we can use the evidence to determine if a thing is a thing or not. So, testing a theory. So there was a theory that came up a few years ago, about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, but it's kind of been talked about a lot over the last 10 years, is the insulin hypothesis. So the idea that you eat carbohydrates, it spikes insulin and you get fat. That's been tested. All of this stuff has been done. There is a vast number of meta-analysis now which has never proven the insulin hypothesis. What the RCTs have shown us, to the contrary, is that there are no difference in any type of diet so long as calories and protein are controlled for. So if you have somebody eating a high carbohydrate diet and somebody eating a low carbohydrate diet, if calories and protein are the same in both diets, it doesn't matter which macronutrient they're eating more of, because they're going to get the same outcome. You're going to lose weight regardless. So what that actually does, not only does it not prove the theory that insulin is causing people to gain weight, it's actually showing us that all diets work, but the reason they work is because they control calories and energy balance, and therefore you can actually eat more of the foods that you like the most, and as long as you're controlling calories and eating a reasonable amount of protein, you're going to get the same outcome as somebody who's restricting themselves of all the foods that they enjoy to get the same result. But the difference being, if you're eating foods that you enjoy, that's more sustainable. You're going to stick to that diet. This person with the highly restrictive diet that they don't enjoy isn't going to stick to it. And adherence is important when it comes to that sort of thing. So evidence, really, really important. You collate a lot of evidence. It's always assumed that more research is needed. That's the great thing about science, is that you always have to maintain a healthy level of skepticism, that you always maintain an open mind. There's always more to learn. So this is important, even if you yourself don't really understand or haven't looked at the evidence. It's important that the people that you follow, the influences that you pay attention to, are following an evidence-based approach. Otherwise, they're going to be giving you lies, bullshit, and fake facts and fake news. And you can always tell the difference, because an evidence-based practitioner will say to you, they won't deal in absolutes. They won't deal in sensationalism. Someone like myself will say to you, well, you know what, dieting is a lot simpler than you think. If you just do A, B, and C, and be consistent and be patient. Whereas the non-evidence-based guru will deal in absolutes and hyperbole, and they will speak emotionally rather than logically, and they will tell you, don't do that, that's really bad, do this. They'll say to you, my diet worked really well, so you should do the same diet as me and buy my book. So you can always tell the bullshit peddler and the shill compared with the evidence-based practitioner. One seems sexy and sensational and new and exciting, and the other one isn't dealing in those absolutes, is just giving you plain facts, and it's not sexy, but it works. But is evidence always useful? I mean, can you ever go with anecdotes and opinions and observations? To some extent, yes, and sometimes you will have to apply a little bit of critical thinking to the evidence, and you might look at it and go, well, the evidence says this, but my experience is this, and I've observed this with my clients, so maybe there's a meeting of minds somewhere in the middle, and that's absolutely fine to do that. The absence of evidence isn't always evidence that something doesn't exist, but in some cases it kind of does do that. And I'll give you a really good example why. So let's talk about Sasquatch or Bigfoot. So in North America for hundreds of years, some people believe that there's some kind of giant ape man that lives in the forests. There's been hundreds, if not thousands, of sightings of Sasquatch. People are quite emotionally attached to the legend of Sasquatch, but there is no evidence to prove that Sasquatch exists. By now, with all the technology that we have, everybody carries a phone with a camera on it. There's drones in the sky filming everything. You can't hide anything. Even in uninhabited woodland areas, sooner or later, somebody's going to catch Sasquatch on film. And I don't mean like a blurry, shaky image of some shadowy figure dashing off. I mean, somebody's going to get a picture of Sasquatch. And if not a picture, then there's going to be, a corpse or fossils or stool samples. And there's never been any of those things. So there's never, ever been any evidence that Sasquatch exists. And as the sightings go up and up and up and up and up, and the evidence doesn't move, at some point you're going to have to say, do you know what? This complete absence of evidence is proof that Sasquatch doesn't exist. Sorry, folks. So that's the kind of mindset you need to adopt when you're looking and taking an evidence-based approach to things. It's very, very important, because that's how facts are proven or disproven. And in this modern age of fake news and fake facts, it's really important to understand how to think critically. That's why I made this video. If you've got any questions, put it in the box. Like, share, subscribe. Laters.